Ahoy there, Lorcana fans. Welcome back to Camp Quest. I am Ian, and I was able to attend a Set Champs this weekend. I missed the previous weekends. This was my first Set Champ of the season, and fortunately for me, I was able to take it down and get the Playmat. It is beautiful. Look at this. Look at that. It's gorgeous. And of course, able to get the enchanted card. Also, look at that. Foiling. It is gorgeous. Love it. It's funny because this season we have barely been able to make content. We just had so much going on, including moving and a new space. Going to be getting that set up and optimized for bringing back the Local Lore podcast, which should be, coming back on a bi-weekly basis here in the next week. So you should see that rolling out onto the channel soon. And then, of course, as Whispers in the Well gets closer, we will have some content based around that from Lindsay and I, and probably Gibby as well, chiming in here and there. Maybe we'll even get Brian back on the channel, do some testing of some of the stuff before it comes out. Anyways, but that's not what we're here about. We're here to talk about Set Champs. This was a weird set for me. I didn't really have any of my tried and true cards from previous Set Champs. The rotation metagame removed most of my two favorite archetypes, which was green, purple, tempo, Grurple, as I like to call it, and Ruby Amethyst control with bounce and things like that. And unfortunately, with those two of my favorite decks out of the mix, I went on a spirit journey to find a deck that I felt was powerful enough, but also skill expressive enough to win without also having to play a bunch of random mirror matches in Set Champs, which sometimes can be fun, but oftentimes I enjoy seeing how the different decks interact with each other. So, where did I land, you might ask? It's dogs. I played dogs to my Set Champs and was able to get the win. It felt really powerful. It was a blast to play. And more importantly, I really did feel like, at least with this specific list, I had a lot of agency in my games, despite the games being relatively fast. I think sometimes mistakenly, folks associate aggressive strategies and decks that want to win quickly with I think they associate it with being lower skill, and I've never felt that way in Lorcana, especially because the onus is so often on you to protect your threats and maximize your card investment to get the most out of what you have before your opponent destroys your stuff and stabilizes. So I've never fully bought into that, but some aggressive decks are a little bit more challenging and skill expressive than others, and I really did feel like dogs was giving me all of these amazing tools to be able to win matchups in a lot of different ways. So as you can see here, it was an interesting day, but I had a pretty relatively diverse pool of opponents hitting pretty much each of the big threats in the game. Started off with a 2-0 on the play against the Baja Blast, Under the Sea Clarabelle control. I was able to get a sneaky 2-1 win on the draw against Purple Steel, which was a really tough one, and that's a tough matchup. We'll kind of talk a little bit about that later. I think that I did take an L in round 3 against my Blurple opponent. I was 1-2 on the draw there. That was a really tough one. My opponent was playing really, really well. Shout out to Jess. But I also did in one of the games really struggle with a bricked hand, unable to find really any of my win conditions, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so with that loss kind of sitting on my match record, I was able to get a pretty strong win. And then we played a very grindy game 3 with a Chromacon setup, where I was able to get that Chromacon out early. I was protecting my threats, but just was able to be constantly removing my things, and I could not find any additional resource extension. So I ended up playing for a go-go win. I got to 17. I had a go-go. There was a damaged, a 4 damaged unit on the board, and I top decked Uninkables 3 consecutive turns, and just was able to quest out before I could find an Inkable to get to 4 ink and play my go-go. So anyways, crazy games. Did take the loss there. In round 4, was able to get a 2-0 against my best matchup, which is, of course, the yellow steel or the amber steel. And so that amber steel aggro just really is, kind of feels quite easy for this deck if you know how to play it. And then in Top Cut, I was I believe the 3 seed. This was a 16-player event. We were 1 person off of the going full 5 rounds, which I would have loved. I much prefer playing more Lorcana than less. But rematched into Jess. While I did have to play on the draw, my deck fired on all cylinders. I think Jess had a little bit of bad luck, and so I was able to get that 2-0, and then played another player in the finals that was on Blurple. Shout out to Chris, awesome player I've met in Top Cut many a time, and was able to again get the 2-1 also on the draw with the deck. Which was a lot of fun. I had a pretty blowout game 1 where Chris's deck stumbled a little bit, had ramp a turn too late. Then in my second game on the draw, there was a really long and drawn out double Chromacon game, which ended with me on 19 lore, but Chris was able to find I believe was able to find a big Elsa to fully lock my stuff down, get enough things onto the board. I was at like 14 ink because he had been playing Hades over and over and over, getting rid of all my Lilos that I kept resurrecting. It was a really fun, really wild game, very well played, I think by both of us, which he was able to take. And then in game 3, I just had an absolutely dominant, explosive start on the play, which, considering how many games I played on the draw versus on the play, was something that was a big breath of fresh air to close the match with a big strong showing on the play. Because as you can see from my matches, I lost the die roll or was the lower seed in every game except for my first one against another awesome local player, Patrick. And this is probably the one I really want to be on the play the most in. So very fortunate there, I think. But yeah, so this was the list that I played. Dogs, I think, can be played in a ton of different ways. You can see lists all over the place. I do want to say, I don't consider myself to be a dogs expert. I think I've learned a lot over the last 3 weeks where I've been trying to pick up the deck, learn it, try different things out, find a build that I felt would be effective for set champs, and then, learn the lines. I will say this, it is a very difficult deck to pick up and play. I've talked to a lot of people, both online and in person, that have, picked up the deck for 5 or 6 games, struggled with it, and put it away. And I think this is a deck that, it really does ask you to learn the intricacies, the lines, the different ways that it can find wins, and to develop certain tendencies and patience to allow you to find what is ultimately a series of fast combos. I corrected somebody at the set champs where they were kind of looking at the field and kind of lumped me, the only dogs player at the event, by the way, lumped it in with aggro. And I kind of was like, well, it's, in my opinion, it's not really aggro. It's a fast combo deck. It can certainly play all-out aggro, but in many ways, you're playing really hard into one or more of your win conditions, which requires you to do often atypical moves that a straight aggro deck would not want to make. If you look at an Amber Steel archetype, they're going to be, setting up a Tiana, hopefully throwing a bodyguard in front of it, getting fast questers like the Nulls, and just going to town, and hopefully they will be at 20 before you find a solve for their Tiana. Very powerful deck. It's not necessarily easy, but it is straightforward. And this, I think, is anything but straightforward. And we can kind of talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, it is a deck that, it's a deck that requires you to look at and evaluate the different ways it can play if you're going to have success with it. So moving on here, this was the kind of sort of the full screen of the list. I did make I kind of hybridized from a few different lists. I want to shout out, so I'm going to say a second ago, I do want to shout out some of the other great players that certainly have significantly more experience with this deck than me. Some creators, like, I think if you want to really, really learn dogs, go watch some of the content that Ghosty has made with Southside Gaming, sort of one of the originators of this Under the Sea version of the deck. Had been making waves with it, early on in the set. I think I would also suggest going and checking out the TFM Forbidden Mountain group, which had a player, I think her name is Melissa, I hope I'm not getting that wrong, had done really well with this at Bologna. I think placed 72nd, 79th. For some reason, those two numbers are coming into my brain, and both of which can really break this deck down and show you, a lot more, detail than I can, some of the reasons for specific cards in their lists and, ways to play it. So, I would highly recommend looking at some of those things if you're interested in playing it at a tournament or at a high level. But my goal with this video is to kind of give you the overview. Even if you're not going to play dogs, hopefully this will give you an understanding and appreciation for dogs, and maybe even give you a way to try to combat dogs now that you know some of our horrible secrets, right? So yeah, I felt that taking this to a set champs, I wanted to have multiple win conditions to handle different matchups, and I knew that because of the core structure of the deck, I would be able to find them. That core structure is, of course, because of this 7-drop tramp, which costs 1 less for each character you have in play. And then when he comes into play, you get to draw and then discard a number of cards equal to the other characters in play, aka however much he was discounted by. So what you can do is set up really wide board states, and this is what the general game plan is going to be. You're going to try to play 1-drops on your first 3 turns of the game, and you're going to try to protect those 1-drops. You don't want those 1-drops to get blown up and challenged, because that means you have to invest more characters into the board before you can get this tramp down. Sometimes that means if those characters all get blown up, tramp will be sitting in your hand and you won't be able to play him, making it a completely dead card. So you want to do everything in your power to avoid letting that tramp become a dead card. More than that, you want to make sure you have enough characters on board that when you play it, you can play it for as cheap as possible and see as many cards as possible off of that draw effect. So the thing that Tramp does is set up all of your big combos and the ways that you want to win the game once he's in play. So let's talk about that. So the way that I look at this, and again, if you watch content from somebody else who plays dogs, they may not view it the same way I do, which is okay. Again, like I said, I built this deck for the purpose of playing at set champs. Now, I will be going to Milwaukee, and I will probably be playing dogs when I do, but I'm going to be looking at that from a different lens. I'm going to be looking at that from the lens of, what do I want? What kind of build do I want to take? Where to an environment where I know that I may be running into, world's caliber players most rounds. And also, what am I going to take if I know that I may have to, consider my endurance as a player across, 9 rounds of play. So that may change slightly, but I will say that list I showed you, I feel very confident that it is a fantastic set champs level list that can give a player that puts the practice in enough time. If they put enough time into it, they will be able to do very well with it. And that's because we have included here, I finally got to the point, 4 different win cons, the way that I like to frame it. So you have Tramp. We've already established he's the core of the deck. He's the most important mulligan target in almost every matchup. And he can simply win the game on its own by chaining multiple Tramps. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go and play a 1-drop on turn 1, 2 1-drops on turn 2, and another 2 1-drops on turn 3. And I often recommend doing that because you often do not want to like ink to 3 and then play 3 1-drops, because your hand will be basically empty at that stage. A lot of the top players, if you go and you watch how they play, especially like you watch some of the streams from Bologna or you watch some of Ghosty's games on his stream, I can certainly attest to the fact that when you see them only inking to 2, especially when they're on the play and they don't have that extra card, that is definitely the correct thing to do. If you go 1-drop on 1, 2 1-drops on 2, 2 1-drops on 3, you'll have 5 1-drops going into turn 4. Usually, they will all make it there because a lot of them are high defense. Even if 1 gets removed, that's okay because you can ink to 3, and then with a discount of 4, play Tramp. But the optimal line is seeing your characters develop and going into your turn 4 with 5 characters in play, because what you can do is set up a turn where you play a 1-drop down and then play a Tramp for a single ink, draw 6 cards, discard 6 cards, and perhaps in those 6 cards, you will have found another Tramp, which, of course, you can now play for free, because with the first Tramp, you'll have gone to 7, and now you'll have 7 characters in play. That Tramp is free. And then you can play that Tramp. And if you find another Tramp, you can play that Tramp for free. And keep going, putting multiple 2/6 that quest for 2 bodies into play early in the game, and then snowballing the lead, questing your other characters out. Multiple of your characters care about having playing either multiple characters into play on the same turn, or having a character named Tramp in play to quest for more. So that can set up these big swing turns. You can quest for like 8 or 9 in turn 1, and then the following turn, there's no way they're going to deal with all of those 1-drops. And you have those multiple 2/6 quest for 2 Tramps in the back, plus whatever you play on the following turns to close the game out. So that is a win condition in of itself. It's a fantastic one. When you get it, you feel unstoppable most of the time. But the other thing is, you may not hit another Tramp, or you may have had to play a Tramp for 3 ink, and you're not going to be able to chain multiples. What you can do then is use that draw and that filter that you're getting to set up other win conditions, to find other things that are going to help you win the game, 2-3 turns down the road. And so what can that look like? You have these 3 other, at least in my list, these 3 other win condition cards. This lady is funny because I have only recently come to start thinking of her as a win condition. But in reality, she will cement victories just by refilling your depleted hand while your opponent is still dealing with your 5-6 character wide board. And remember, a lot of your 1-drops are awkward to deal with. 0-4s, 1-4s, 1-3s. The math that intentionally is set up so that Elsas are awkward. You need an Elsa plus something to get rid of your Ursula or your 2-drop Tramp. You need to have a Fire the Cannons plus a Captain Hook to deal with a Little John or a Nala, right? And so obviously, while they're dealing inefficiently with your characters, if you can either shift a lady into play or get to 5 ink, which admittedly is difficult and goes against the suggestion that I made earlier, but if you know that you're going for a lady line and not necessarily a Tramp line, you can break the rule of don't ink past 2 or 3 and start trying to work towards a lady, because you know that the Tramp chaining play is maybe cut off to you, right? And once you get that lady down, not only is it a powerful stat line that's difficult to deal with in this metagame, but you can also pull back aggressive threats, Daisy Ducks, little 1-drop ladies that can quest for 2 if you have Tramp in play. You can pull back Go-Go Tomagos, which can help you burst lore, to close out games against opponents that have been forced to board trade into you. But you can also, pull those specific cards you need if you're in a board trading battle, which against certain matchups like Amethyst Steel and Amber Steel will sometimes happen where you are forced to take the fight to them, which is something that you can do with buffing characters like Merryweather or the 2-drop Tramp. So this can sometimes help you pull back specific cards you need. It can shift in, it can shift onto any of the 12 ladies that you have in the deck, the 8 ones and the 4 of the 3s. It can shift in with a bigger body that can take a surprise trade on your opponent or quest for 2. It can pull back those specific cards you need to maybe, a 2-drop Tramp to buff something, to remove, an Exerted Tiana or something like that. If you have a wide enough board, you can actually take out Tiana without paying the tax, or with the help of that buffing Tramp. But the other thing that's nice is you can shift in and sing a surprise Under the Sea on a board where they thought they were safe. They were looking at, maybe an Ursula and a Nala and a 1-drop lady, and they're saying, well, that only adds up to 4. But if you shift in that lady, you can then sing Under the Sea and remove all of their low drops, which again to certain matchups is really strong. The downside, of course, is it can be hard to get into play. As we've already mentioned, it costs 5 to play for full price and 3 to shift onto. Again, you become somewhat reliant on setting this up and like having ladies in play, but good opponents will know to deal with your shift target ladies first if they can. And so that can be a little bit of a challenge if they know to deal with your shift targets. You may be on 3 ink with this as your only card planning to shift in, and they fire the cannons, your 1-drop lady, and now you're stuck with an uninkable 5 cost in hand. That can be a risk, and you have to weigh the pros and cons of seeking these lines. You have to sit there and think to yourself, can I win without having to rely on this lady getting into play for 3? Is there a way to win? Maybe it means inking to 4, and knowing that, like, hey, even if they get rid of my shift target, I can hopefully draw an inkable, ink it, and play it for full price. So it's one of those cards that requires a lot of foresight and a lot of good experience timing it out, not holding on to it too long. A lot of times, if you get in that early game, it can be really tough because it's sitting in your hand as an uninkable. So look to play cards like Bobby to draw a card and discard a card, and get it out of your hand early, because it's really it's a card that you don't want to see early in the game when you're really trying to just chain 1-drops and set up for your tramps, or get enough units into play to Under the Sea. So let's talk about Under the Sea. This is the card that lets you single-handedly dominate the Amber Steel matchup. The Amber Steel matchup is almost free. And I say almost because it revolves entirely around Under the Sea. Well, not entirely. One of the things that you can do if you catch an opponent off guard, or if they have a very specific line of weak characters and not Tiana, you can actually board trade with them relatively well, thanks to the inclusion of the 2-drop Tramp and the Merryweather, like I mentioned before. But even the 1-drop lady, the 0/3 one that gets +1 whenever you play a character, you can really surprise your opponent by dropping 2 or even 3 characters, getting it up to 2 or 3 attack, and all of a sudden you are swinging into Nala's to break its resist and let your Daisy hit into it. But besides those situations where you're taking out rhinos with a +5 Tramp 2 that comes in and buffs your Little John, right? Setting aside those scenarios where that all kind of lines up for you, Under the Sea is almost unstoppable in that matchup. They either have to hope you don't get it, perfectly time a Pete or play multiple Petes in a row, or they have to abandon the best cards in their deck, right? The Tianas and Nalas and stuff like that, and really try hard to win by playing the suite of 3 attack or higher units in the list, which is easier for you to exploit because it buys you more time, since they don't quest as well, to set up other win conditions, whether it's chaining some tramps or board trading into those things with surprise buffs. It also dominates the mirror match if you find it before the opponent. Now, I mentioned earlier I don't really care for mirror matches. this is the thing where the reason I would never take dogs to a tournament without Under the Sea is because it's the only way you win the mirror match uh, is with Under the Sea. If one player has it and the other player doesn't in dogs, you will lose, assuming that they find it. But again, between 3 copies and all of the self-milling you're doing with bobbies and tramps and stuff like that, seems like pretty good odds that you can find it. It can also be tactically deployed against Blurple and Amethyst Steel. There are specific lines that Blurple and Amethyst Steel can make where they flood the board with 2 attack or lower things. So think lines like Basil into Tipo, into Genie, into Elsa. Now, a strong Blurple player is going to try to avoid that because they know you may have Under the Sea locked and loaded. But sometimes because Blurple has to often sell out its mulligans to get ramp, a lot of times they will be sort of at the mercy of the curve that they're given by the deck. And so if that curve is 1-drop, 1-drop, 2-drop Genie Elsa, and you're able to find enough costed units on the board to Under the Sea, you can really punish that and then run away with the game. That is how I won, I think, 2 different games against Blurple on the weekend. That's the curve they had. They didn't have any other options. So I was able to set up the Under the Sea and then run away with it before they're able to get back onto the board. Same thing with Amethyst Steel, right? They have a lot of 1s and 2s, and while yes, they do love playing their Calhouns, they love, especially in the evasive build, which is pretty challenging, playing their Genies, their Dragon Genies and stuff, which will be 3 attack or higher. Sometimes, again, they get stuck with drawing, playing lots of 1-drops. Okay, I'm playing, hooks and Palace Guards and Diablos and, whatever else. And so if that is the situation that you find yourself in where they've played maybe 3 out of their 5 characters, or, it's like, Hook, Palace Guard, Calhoun, and Yzma, well, you can sometimes win the game and kind of quest and get over the finish line by dealing with like 3 of their things in one fell swoop. They swing into you with whatever's left. You then return trade with buffs and quest with everything else. So there are some lines where Under the Sea can work, but again, it's very highly contingent on what your opponent is putting into play. If they know to avoid putting all of those, low power units into play, if they're avoiding, playing a line that includes multiple 2 attack or lower units, and then when you see that they're doing that, it's usually good to like fade Under the Sea and start milling it away with Bobby and just try to play for a turbo tramp chain, which is sort of the biggest way that you win against Amethyst Steel, which otherwise, barring that, can just be so challenging because of their, constant removal. And then there's Chromacon. So Chromacon's ridiculously powerful, but it's not as straightforward as it seems. It is a card that going wide and playing Chromacon puts your opponents in seemingly impossible positions. If they challenge into your stuff and clear your thing, they know that their stuff is almost certainly getting removed too, which creates a lot of weird situations. More importantly, it creates a lot of opportunities for your opponents to make mistakes. A lot of players will play things down, play new characters, and then trade in with their characters, allowing you to take your pick of the litter as to what you want to return. But on the flip side, sometimes you really should be playing characters with powerful on-play effects before you start swinging in, because if they swing a Calhoun into, one of your characters and you banish one of their, or not banish, but bounce one of the other characters they were planning to attack with, it might throw off the math for the rest of their turn. So it requires them to sit and think about each line that they want to take and how you could disrupt it by choosing different characters on their board to bounce. And they have to kind of sit there and process and think through it. Chromacon is very good, in my experience, on the play because you can often go 1-drop, 1-drop, 1-drop on your first 2 turns. Don't quest with it on turn 2. Don't quest with your 1-drop on turn 2. Then on turn 3, slam the Chromacon, quest with all 3, and then on the following turn, rebuild onto the board. You can also just wait till turn 4 to do it if your opponent has a particularly slow start. But what this allows you to do is if you go 1-drop, 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 and they played 1-drop and a 2-drop, their 2-drop will swing into, their 1 or their 2 will swing into one of your characters, you bounce the other. Now 2 of your things are alive, and they have either only one character, the one that they just played for turn, their 3-drop. Maybe if they had a character that lived the attack, it's exerted. And now on the following turn, you can buff your things up, remove the one exerted character. The only character they have left in play is the character that they played for turn. But you, in theory, have the 2 characters that lived the previous turn, plus a 3rd, 4th, or even 5th character, depending on what you were able to replay out onto that board on that turn 4 of yours. So the numbers begin stacking up. Every card they remove of yours, you remove one of theirs. You also can sometimes, in late game scenarios, remove one of your own and replay it to get its play effect back again. Or if you just want to get into play because your board is getting thin, they have managed to, maybe through effects that that bounce your own characters, or maybe through effects that put it on the bottom of the deck, or put it into the inkwell, all of which get around Chromacon. Perhaps they have managed your board and they do have a wide enough board, and you actually just care about getting across the finish line. So instead of letting them trade into a character you know that they'll kill, you can bounce it and replay it fresh, unexerted, the next turn to try to get across the finish line. So there's a lot of ways to use Chromacon. That being said, it requires a ton of practice to use correctly. And that doesn't just go for you, that actually also goes for your opponent. The reason I like to take it into a set championship environment, the reason I opted to bring it, is because as we were testing with my testing group, as we were testing it, we were realizing how many games early on were getting busted wide open because players, were not playing around it correctly. And then even though my testing group managed to get a ton of experience correctly playing around Chromacon, we thought to ourselves, why not ask the question of our opponents? Hey, have you practiced against Chromacon? Are you going to get all flustered once you see it hit the board and misplay into it? It's a pretty common thing to see, and a lot of players, they have misconceptions around how to play around it because they just haven't yet put the time in. So that can be something that can be really effective in environments where you think that they're like set champs, where you think that might come up and that you may run into a player that you can kind of, put the Chromacon out there and test them on their knowledge of navigating the matchup when a Chromacon is on the board. So those are the win cons, and that's why I've included each of them. I think that for a set champs environment, I probably would play all of these again if my goal was to have as well-rounded of a spread of matchups as possible. Like I said, Chromacon can be excellent for Blurple and Amethyst Steel matchups because they do want to be trading into your stuff. But again, you have to know what to bounce because obviously you sometimes do want to bounce their Elsa, but of course, sometimes you don't want to bounce their Elsa because it will exert something. So figuring out what to bounce with Chromacon just requires practice. And if you're willing to put in the practice yourself, you should definitely take it to set champs, because then you get to have that sort of benefit of saying, has my opponent practiced this? And sometimes the answer is no. So just taking a look at this slide here, these are some other considerations for dogs that I've seen across the interwebs or things that I have tested myself. Obviously, I'm not saying you put one of each of these things in. I just needed to stuff them all into a deck list so I could show you visually. You have all sorts of things. Obviously, you can popularize at Bologna. You have the Aurora Tiana package. I did not care for it personally, just because I felt like Tiana was a bit of a clunky card. You have Pluto, which I do like, and I am currently testing a build that uses Pluto pretty heavily in it. Merfolk, if you plan to go all aggressive, or, and I think this is valid, if you don't really care for the combo components of the Under the Sea side of things, I think it's totally valid for you to just go all in on Chromacons, dump Under the Sea and play a faster, more aggressive deck. You just have to acknowledge that your matchup spread is going to change drastically as you're now removing the strength of your matchup into Amber Steel and removing the strength of your matchup, or at least removing your ability to reliably win the mirror match in favor of having a slightly better matchup into the slower control decks like Blurple, like the green-blue, assuming they don't Under the Sea you, which, by the way, if I haven't said it yet, when you play green-blue, just mulligan everything for Ursula. It will win you the games more often than not. It's kind of, if you find Ursula, you usually win. If you don't find Ursula, you often lose. It kind of comes down to that. But because of your ability to have such a generous mulligan and the ability of Tramp to filter, it can often help you get that Ursula, hopefully in time. But yeah, you could play a much more aggressive build with like Merfolk and Fred, maybe even Pegasus. And whether you run Under the Sea or not, I think that those are valid cards. But again, you potentially hurt your steel matchups, as now these are weaker units that can be removed with cannons and stuff like that. Jim Deere kind of goes nicely with the Tiana package. Megara is a weird one because it does what Merryweather does, but it costs 2 instead of 1. That is, of course, not as good for when you're just trying to get 1-drops in play to discount your Tramp, but it's better all the rest of the time because it is a 2-coster to help sing together for Under the Sea. And if you want to try out Heffalumps and Woozles, which I have done some testing on, and I am back and forth on it over Improvise. Improvise and Heffalumps and Woozles mostly being in there to pop illusions from Blurple and Amethyst Steel. But Meg can sing that, so maybe you consider switching Merryweathers for Megs if you want to play Heffalumps. Robin Hood, a little bit of extra burst lore. Yzma is a card that's been in and out of mine. I just really like the Bobby effect of draw discard, and Yzma's more of that. This was pretty heavily played back in the Chernobog days before rotation, where you played this shell with the big Chernobog because you'd fill up your discard pile. Clarabelle and Hey Hey as 3 cost, and Lewis really, actually, well, all of these 3-costers from here over are sort of tech cards for different things. Clarabelle, if you're playing faster and you want to be more aggressive, this can kind of give you an extra card if you're playing in the aggressive shell. I kind of prefer it if you're just going straight Chromacon and not Under the Sea. It just can be sometimes difficult if you have more cards than your opponent. A 3-cost that does nothing is terrible for this deck. Hey Hey, on the flip side, is kind of good if you are playing a slightly slower build. This can be really nice in a Blurple, but not a lot else. But being able to get a little bit more ink into your inkwell so you can start playing Go-Go's and just higher cost of cards. So if you're going to play a slightly higher curve build, Hey Hey's pretty nice. Lewis actually really helps the Amber Steel matchup and can even just call out shift targets for the green blue. I like pairing Lewis with Plutos because you can play Pluto on 1 into Lewis on 2 and call out a Clarabelle that give it Reckless and force it to exert itself so you can clean it up on the next turn. Prince Philip is an aggressive card, but it also doubles as a warded character that can sit on the board and help set up an Under the Sea. Scrump is another one. I think it's slightly out of vogue. This was Ghosty's sort of go-to early on in the meta. I tested it a lot. It's solid, but I kind of just started accepting that I'm not going to always be able to Under the Sea everything and instead just focus on Under the Seeing the 2 and lower cards and then snowballing from there. But this can actually give you a way to leverage your wide board into a even more powerful combo. If you want to play an even more combo-y combo deck, try Scrump. Put that in there with your Under the Seas. This will let you lower other characters with 3 or 4 attack into the requisite range for Under the Sea to wipe them off the board. So those are some other considerations for dogs. This was, again, the list, just flashing it up here as we close out. I really would, if you're willing to put the time in, recommend this to anyone for a Set Champs level event. I think it's well-rounded. I think it is, while it does have a relatively high uninkable count. It is not, certainly not the highest out there. It's currently sitting at 16, and I've seen lists up to 20 or even more than 20. So I think that there will not be too many times where you'll be sitting there, you know, with a bricked hand, and especially considering you often only want to ink to 2 or 3. Having a higher uninkable count is a little bit more acceptable. If you have questions about how this is played, if you have requests for other decks for me to do similar breakdowns for, I can't promise I'll win a set championship with it, but I am happy to take a look at it. Please leave them down and consider liking the video and subscribing. We're almost to 1,000 followers and subscribers on YouTube, so you know, it would be, boy, would it be really cool to get there. We're almost there. We're in the 900s. So show this to a friend who loves Lorcana. Show this to a friend who wants to learn dogs, and you know, help share the channel around so we can get to that sweet 4 digis. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you on the next one.